welcome again to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, Integrity Deficit Disorder. We have as our guest today, Mr. Craig Nelson and his book on World War II, V for Victory, Franklin Roosevelt's American Resolution and the Triumph of WW2. That's how I wrote it down. And I'm ready to go. Tell us all about it to start with, and then I've got some questions for you. Oh, let me ask you now, have you done, is this the 6th book that you've done?
This is the 9th book. It's my 6th history book and my 3rd World War II book.
Ah, okay. All right, that helps. What do you do besides writing?
Nothing. I write for a living. I used to be an executive with Harper & Row, Random House, and Hyperion. So for 20 years, I was an editor and a book publishing executive. And then I switched to writing full-time with history books.
Right. Well, you learned all the ropes with that history.
I learned the business.
Exactly. I always dig into the table of contents on books. They show you things that give you a little hint in what's it about, or please define, that type of thing. Let's start that. I've got other things as well. I liked your prelude. That was, for me, that's interesting because I didn't know all of that. Don't tell my wife. Let's see. Okay, you got a part 1, a part 2, and a part 3. Foundation is the part 1. Part 2 is the road to Pearl Harbor. In that chapter, I looked at it, it says, how to make America first. Sounds familiar, huh? So what is all that, how to make America first? What's in there?
So this book is about how the American people, when we were at our nadir as a nation, when we were beaten down, weak, hopeless, filled with despair, we'd suffered through the Great War, the Spanish flu, and the Great Depression. And people were really hopeless and at rock bottom. And that group of people rose up to defeat the greatest evil in human history. And how this actually happened and how it was done is the story of V is for Victory. And it explains how the secret weapon to winning that war was the arsenal of democracy, the incredible unleashing of American business, enterprise, and manufacturing. I almost said a subtitle, How the Rust Belt Saved Us from Hitler. I almost went with that subtitle instead of this one. Maybe we would have gotten more people who don't care for Roosevelt to buy it. But anyway, so really, it's the story of how Roosevelt turned the country around and got people to think bigger of themselves and go out into the world and help to defend democracy in the world. And it begins right at he takes office in 1933. He does something called a fireside chat, and he gets people to have faith in the banking system just by talking to them on the radio. And this reverses what had been a loss of 5,000 banks, taking everybody's savings with them, and turns the nation around and keeps people from pulling their money out of banks. It solves the banking crisis. One speech on the radio. And he then prepares a whole bunch of legislation that saves the country financially. And it was so incredible that one congressman saw it and said, it reads like the first chapter of Genesis, because this legislation to fix the country was so big. So right. Normally, when we talk about this history, we say that there was a New Deal Roosevelt and a World War II Roosevelt, because he was in office for 12 years. But I found that a lot of what happened in the New Deal prepared us to defeat Hitler. For example, during the New Deal, we built such things as the Golden Gate Bridge and the Hoover Dam, and taking on those enormous projects prepared American manufacturers and the military and the American bureaucrats to go forth and invade Normandy. So these giant projects intermingled to people's minds. So what happened in all this is that Charles Lindbergh came along. Now, all of us remember Charles Lindbergh. This is finally getting to your question about America First. All of us remember Charles Lindbergh as the great hero of the 1920s. He crossed the Atlantic. He was an airmail carrier before crossing the Atlantic. He didn't really know how to use celestial navigation, but that's how he did it. So he was a great American hero, and he came across at exactly the perfect time. But he became so famous that his child was kidnapped and murdered. And this turned Lindbergh against American society. He blamed the American people for losing his kid. And he exiled himself and his family in Europe. And there he met a bunch of people who said, well, Hitler's going to win this thing. No one can beat him. There's no reason to try and stop him. Just get on the bandwagon and accept what's going to happen here. And that's what Lindbergh did. He returned to the United States and started lecturing that we should not fight against Hitler, that we should accommodate him. And the organization backing him was called America First. So this entire story about how Lindbergh became a foe of Roosevelt and how they argued with each other on the radio is how to make America first.
Fantastic. It's how long did it take you to write the book?
6 years.
Okay, that's duly done.
But what I want to explain, however, that one of the things that was amazing is that the nation really doesn't want to have anything to do with the war in Europe. They think they're going to be protected by the Atlantic Ocean, that Hitler can't possibly come here. But Roosevelt knew he could come here and knew he was crazy and knew we had to get ready. So what he did was he very carefully set forth one policy after the next. And each one of these, he argued on the radio with Lindbergh. They would give alternate speeches on the radio, which was like the internet then. Everybody had it. Everybody was listening to it all the time. So tens of millions of Americans could listen to these debates and take part in what the future of the country was going to look like. So it really was the American system in action, and it really worked.
Well, it convinced everybody, I think, that was call themselves Americans. I read something here that Marilyn Monroe was Rosie the Riveter.
This is a fantastic story. So people don't forget that Ronald Reagan was originally a great fan of Franklin Roosevelt, and he worked for Roosevelt. He helped run an operation to keep the ordinary civilians enthusiastic about the war. And as part of that, he sent a photographer out to take pictures of beautiful women working on the assembly lines. And this guy goes to a drone factory in California. Before doing this book, I didn't even know there were drones in World War II. So that was exciting. So he goes to this drone factory and he meets this beautiful married woman. She's 18. Her husband's off in the Merchant Marines in the Pacific. And he just falls under her spell. He stays with her for 2 weeks and takes pictures so she can have a modeling portfolio. She uses the portfolio to go to get a Hollywood contract and changes her name to Marilyn Monroe. So the arsenal of democracy not only defeated Hitler, it gave us Marilyn Monroe. Thank you, arsenal of democracy.
I have to concur because I've got two big pictures when you walk into this home. One of them's Marilyn, and the next one is John Wayne.
Oh, how fantastic.
Hug it on the wall. Now, the other thing about the Rosie the Riveters, my mother was Rosie the Riveter. And she was, that's right. And I was going to say it had to be someplace in Tennessee, although I looked and hadn't found anything about that yet. But the reason they liked her as a riveter because she's only 5 feet tall.
Right.
And she was tied to the tail of the plane.
Yes.
That's where she did it.
Yes. And when Roosevelt went to visit the Ford plant, which was making bombers, they showed him the little people who worked in the wings with the tight spots, like where your mother worked. Now, have you ever tried to run a rivet gun?
No.
Oh, well,
It's like cement.
yeah, it's like a submachine gun that shoots bolts, and it will throw you right off right on your butt. And so the idea of women running this thing was amazing to people, and that's why it became so legendary. I found 7 of them, 7 Rosie the Riveters, and I'm sure there are more.
Let me see here. If one here, let's see now. What is the gun in her purse?
Well, this is a very funny story. So one of the things I really love in doing these books is finding out things about people I had no idea were true. So for example, I found out about Franklin Roosevelt that he had this persona that he was always happy. He liked everybody. He was always welcoming. He seemed to be curious about anything in the world. And he told Orson Welles, you know, Orson, you and I are the greatest actors in the world. And he did have this incredible persona that he put on as a politician. And people kept trying to see the real Roosevelt, and they never could. So that was amazing. But the thing that really amazed me was that Eleanor, who I sort of thought was this fuddy-duddy type of person, didn't need she didn't need police protection when she traveled because she had a gun in her purse and she knew how to use it. She was quite a tough woman. And I have stories about her like this over and over again. One of my favorites is that in 43, she decides that what she wants to do is travel the Pacific Theater and visit the wounded and dying men fighting the war in the Pacific. And no one wants her to go. And finally, she convinces her husband that she should go. And she goes on this trip. It was completely grueling. She covered almost the entire Pacific Theater in like 6 weeks. She met with 400,000 injured and dying men. 400,000. And she had the biggest effect of anyone who came through that theater. And Bill Halsey, Admiral Halsey, did not want her to come. And he wanted to find out why she had this effect. And he came across a private who was dying. And he said, why was it so important for you to meet Eleanor Roosevelt? And the guy said, she was something we hadn't seen in so long, an American mother. Isn't that heartbreaking?
That's a fact.
Yes.
Probably a lot of those. And of course, that few words explains everything right there.
Yes, absolutely.
The first victories is a chapter.
Right. So after, so Roosevelt had to get Americans to face the fact that we needed to fight. And he was sort of on his own from 38 to 1940. But then France fell in 1940. And of course, Pearl Harbor happened in 1941. So after those two things, the public turned around entirely and became very enthusiastic about this. But our army was just not ready yet. General Marshall wanted to do a Normandy invasion as early as 1942, but we were just not there yet. So the British lost all of our allies lost all of their Asian colonies. We just had loss after loss after loss after loss across all of 1942. And it wasn't really until we had the Doolittle Raid, which was a very daring mission, who jumped across the pond, used Army bombers on a Navy aircraft to bomb Japan in retaliation for Pearl Harbor in April, 4 months after Pearl Harbor. They didn't do much damage. They were a tremendous PR effect on the American people. And it wasn't until we then went into North Africa that we finally started succeeding. And that North Africa, known as Operation Torch, was a very easy thing to accomplish in many ways because the Vichy French government agreed to put aside their arms in 3 days. So the Americans came in across Morocco and Tunisia. They didn't have such a rough time. The British were still facing Rommel, and that was a rougher time, but it was a pretty easy thing to do. It was a necessary thing to do. Americans needed to have a win a year after Pearl Harbor, and finally they did.
Interesting. Have you considered a career in supply chain management? This is FDR, I would the king of this.
So this is a funny story. So When I was trying to figure out what book to do next 6 years ago, a military analyst very casually said to me, on the battlefield, logistics eat strategy for lunch. And I thought, what the hell are we all writing these military history books about strategy for? I mean, they're all about strategy, right? So I thought, this is really unbelievable. So I started looking into it. And then all these other analysts said, oh, yeah, the secret to winning World War II was the mechanics and the machinery and all this stuff we made, that everybody had jeeps and tanks and trucks and planes and everybody, all the Germans were still on horses. We were running around in our jeeps. And so I thought, this is unbelievable. So finally, I just had to put together a book about this whole history. And it turns out that besides, stuff, you need to be able to get your jeeps in the right place at the right time, and your men and your food and your clothing and your camping and all of this stuff that you need to wage war all has to be very well coordinated. And World War II really was the high point of Americans learning how to do that. And it led to logistics and supply chain management that American producers use today.
Well, there have been so many movies and shows and so forth regarding World War II. I watched them all. At that point, I wondered if I was to get shipped off to Nam, and you betcha, I took my 1 year in Nam and then came home. But it was the military was certainly, I can't say, an indication of that is that in the military, they changed in the 50s after Korea. They called it from brown shoe to black. And the brown shoe that they all wore, they said, throw away your brown shoes. We're not gonna look like that anymore. We're gonna have black boots, black, whatever. So the old timers in the Army would often, refer to that in terms of, I wish it was funny, but I was wanting my shoes, my brown ones. They never came.
What was your experience like in Vietnam?
It was, I wasn't a grunt. Grunts were infantry. I was in the aviation part of it. And then in my spare time, I'd hitch a ride on the Chinooks, the
helicopters.
Two sets of blades. And that was interesting for a while. They wanted me to fix radios and things like that, of which I had avionics, and I said, I'm not going to do that. Put me on a Chinook, and and it worked for a while. And then I got to come home, so that was a good thing.
So my father was also in the Air Force in World War II, and he served in New Guinea. And I actually went to New Guinea on vacation and got to go to some of the islands where he had been. But it took me, he didn't tell me about his experience in World War II until after I wrote a book about World War II. He finally admitted that he had to clean up the bodies when there had been a Japanese airstrike. The first time, I was like 40 years old before I heard about this.
Wow. Well, I consider myself lucky because a lot of guys weren't. And I remember during the time when we came home to rebellious college campuses. And the part of that was that most people today would shake my hand and say, thanks for your service. And I say, just tell me welcome home. That's true.
Yes.
They'd pick fights with, it's almost like what happened on a beach in California. Just some of the local teenagers beat up on some of the Marines. Did you see that in the news?
Oh.
Yeah, crazy.
That's
World's upside down.
That's terrible. I really think that a lasting effect of Vietnam has been a terrible split between the civilian and the military populations. You know, during World War II, especially, the sort of country was united in fighting the war, but it seems like they haven't been united in fighting any war since, really, not really Korea, not Vietnam. And that's a real shame. I wish we could figure out how to fix that. I also wish we could figure out how to fix the Rust Belt. I think it's sort of embarrassing. We have a giant piece of the country called the Rust Belt, and then it just sits there rusting. It would be nice to try and bring back American manufacturing, and I hope people will do that.
You know, you have a paragraph here in your prelude, and I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking I never really put that piece together. It's a big piece. And if you don't mind, it's a short paragraph. Historians have charted two American revolutions, one establishing the country in 1776 and another ending chattel slavery in 1861. There was, however, a third, an American Revolution begun in 1933. And that's what you were describing. A lot of people went hungry then. And one that extended across the whole of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. This gives me a better thought whenever I think of FDR. The guy had his stuff together.
Well, I have to say that I think of FDR as being the greatest politician in American history, and I mean that in every sense of the word. Okay. The more you know about him, the more you see why many people did not like him, because he was very manipulative and he could get his way all the time. It was like going up against a Mack truck. However, so that said, that he did take us through both the Great Depression and World War II, and the sort of pathetic manner in which we started him with him in 1933 and the triumphant way which we ended him with 1945, it's really something to see. So that's why I say it's another kind of American Revolution.
Right. I remember my daddy talking about that. He wasn't that much of a fan, but then my dad had flat feet, didn't have to go to war. How you like that? And it surprised me with that. Just did. I've enjoyed this visit that you had the opportunity to come and talk to us. I know a lot of people are going to learn things from this.
Me too. Thank you, John.
And by your now, here's the part. Here you tell them where they can find their belt.
So if you can't find V is for Victory by Craig Nelson at your store or online, you can go to my website, which is craignelson.us. It's not .com, because there are 3 famous Craig Nelsons, and a guy has taken that .com name and is trying to extort us out of it. So I can't afford to pay that extortion fee. So it's craignelson.us. And if you go there, you'll learn more about me and have a whole free chapter of the book to read, and you can push on a button and the book will come right to your house.
And that's something. That's amazing.
It is.
Yeah, I do. I like you did it Audible.
Yes,
right?
It's on audio, it's on ebook, and it's in hardcover. And in hardcover, it's only $26. It's 450 pages. That is a good deal.
It is. It is per page. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank our listeners to tuning in to us today. Searching for Integrity is something that I put in front of me and my audience. And for me, for tuning in, I get to thank you very much for doing this here, Craig. Here it is.
Thank you for your hospitality. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. So long and happy trails to all until we see you again.